Hello everyone, my name is Dorka Támas, and today I'm going to talk about the supernatural vision in Sylvia Plath's bee poems. Firstly, I wanted to introduce the sequence, commonly known as the bee sequence or the bee poems. There are a bunch of poems that were written in the summer of 1962 when Plath lived in North Houghton, close to Exeter, and they were inspired by her experience of beekeeping. The poems also include several other influences from literature to her personal experiences, writing to her personal experiences, as her father was a biologist studying bees and a beekeeper himself. The bee poems, namely, are The Bee Meeting, Arrival of the Bee Box, Stings, Wintering, and there was another poem that Plath wrote which didn't include in the sequence in the end. The main theme of these poems are an interrogation of the relationship between the subject of the speaker and the other, who are the bees. And in these poems, we see the emerging queen bee as the alter ego of the speaker. We see this theme of rebirth, continuation of rebirth, which ends with female survival and creative autonomy. And where is the supernatural vision in these poems? So my research builds on from Margaret Murray's fertility cult hypothesis. So Margaret Murray was an Egyptologist in the early 20th century who hypothesized that witches in the early modern period were participating in a sort of fertility cult, despite her theory being not true. And it turned out that she falsified some evidence. And finally, she was discredited in the 60s, 70s from the academic circles. But her theories remained very popular and became the main dominant influence for Gerald Gardner, who developed the neo-pagan Wicca religion in the 1950s England. And I also want to highlight that when Murray developed this hypothesis of fertility cult of witches, so this was a time when conspiracy theories were blooming about certain groups, certain political ideologies, certain organizations. Even the suffragettes were thought to be a sort of cult at that time. So Murray's theory about the cult of witches really blended into this time about different sort of conspiracy theories. And my research also builds on Plath's this continuation pattern in Plath's poems in which flying women are alluded as witches. And the witch metaphor is also functions often for Plath as a sort of umbrella term for the other, which was also an important metaphor in the mid 20th century America during the McCarthy's witch hunt, about the enemy being the enemy, foreign, the diabolic person, the other having some sort of racial connotations as well. So we see these different layers from being the fertility cult of witches. We see a sort of blooming, developing neo-pagan religion in the 1950s, 60s England. We see the post-war political times in which the witch hunt developed an important metaphor for certain type of politics. And we see this metaphor or continuation pattern in Plath's poems in which flying women are alluded many times as witches. And these are all sort of influences that I consider in the bee poems. So the first poem is titled The Bee Meeting, which is actually a portrayal of Plath's experience with meeting with the beekeepers. And she portrays this meeting with the beekeepers as a sort of ritualistic initiation ceremony in which she, the speaker, is alienated. She's being othered as well as the bees are. The bees are also othered, but they're also fearful and portrayed as dark. And critics highlighted before that this poem shows allusions to Nathaniel Hawthorne's story, Young Goodman Brown, which narrates a sort of dreamlike vision of a witch's Sabbath. In this way, Plath's poem is similar because it also portrays a sort of dreamlike vision. We see this constant reappearance of a dreamlike state, for example, with the word eternalizing, and we see her being feared by these bees as well, being feared by the beekeepers in this initiation ceremony. And in the poem, the whiteness, blackness opposition first appears. The whiteness is being associated with protection and virginity, and blackness of diabolic and dangerousness of the bees, which also later reappears in these poems as a sort of racial metaphor as well. Plath also portrays this meeting of the beekeepers as a sort of initiation ceremony, almost like a baptism, which is also suggested by the important figure of the rector, who is portrayed as the man in black, which I talk about later in a second more. So, and the end of the poem highlights. So in the second half of the poem, we see the emerging queen bee persona, who is almost indistinguishable from the speaker. The speaker feels that she's being hunted by the villagers, which is actually the queen bee in the poem, which is also portrayed as a sort of murder ritual initiation. And we see this kind of dreamlike vision because she can't distinguish between herself and the queen bee. In the very end of the poem, the speaker calls herself the magician's girl. And because we know that Plath's father was a beekeeper and studied the bees, I argue that by naming herself the magician girl, she also suggests that the act of beekeeping is a sort of magical ability. So we see a sort of supernatural connotation regarding the bees and beekeeping. As I've said, I wanted to talk a little bit about more the rector figure in the poem, who is named as the man in black. In Plath's journal entry about this beekeeping experience, she tells the story here that the bees are attracted to the rector's dark trouser, and one of the beekeepers suggests that they probably want to join to his church, which has this sort of connotation of a coven-like organization or a religious organization. And in Plath's other sort of in other poems, the man in black is connected usually to a father figure. It also has some diabolic, dark connotations, and so does the rector figure, knowing Plath's hostility or the rector who was the rector in North Houghton, and she also condemned the Church of England for various, she didn't agree with several things of the Church of England. So moving on, the second poem is titled Arrival of the Bee Books. And in this poem, we see a closer relationship develop between the speaker and the bees. And the main theme of this poem, the speaker's choice between enslavement and freedom of the bees, which Linda K. Bunsen argues that it sort of alludes to Shakespeare's The Tempest play. We see this racial metaphor or imagery reappear in connection as we see it in Caliban, who is the sea monster in The Tempest. And this freedom is usually associated with Ariel figure in the Ariel poems. And in this poem, we see Plath or the speaker taking up this Prospero figure of the beekeeper or the magician even, who has the choice between enslavement and granting freedom of the bees, who are again portrayed as dark, dangerous, having this racial imagery alluding to Caliban, further by highlighting that they are uttering unintelligible syllable and they're called as the Roman mob. We see more and more allusions to even to magic and witches by the line when Plath says, "I lay my ears to furious Latin." And during the Reformation period, or even in many times in history, Catholics, Latin language Catholic prayers have been regarded as having diabolic magical power, or seen as diabolic magical practice. And in here, the darkness of the bees again is alluded by the dangerousness, the diabolic character, which again has a sort of allusion to racial metaphors as well. And so we see this closer relationship developing between the speaker and the bees, how she's not sure if she wants to set them free or not. The poem ends with saying that the box is only temporary, so we don't see her final choice of how she decided what to do with the bees. The third of the poem is titled Stings. In this poem, we see the queen bee reappearing, who has a more prominent role in this poem. And this is the first poem in which we actually see the bees being a fertile honey producers, and the sweetness of the bees is also reminiscent to the villanelle, to the poem Lament, which Plath wrote in her which Plath wrote in her adolescent age, in which is about her father's death actually. And in this poem, she associated the honey of the bees as a dangerous substance which killed her father. So we see this opposition between the sweetness of the honey and the honey being also a dangerous substance which can kill, again alluding to a sort of dark, diabolic nature of these bees. In the second half of the poem, Plath explicitly genders the bees as women, and we see this reappearance of female autonomy or creative rebirth, which runs in parallel with her other poems, in which flying women appear, such as the phoenix figure in Lady Lazarus. We see the bees here and the moth in the witch burning, all having these similarities between a witch-like persona, a flying creature, and being a woman. And this the honey also reappears in these stanzas. We see this opposition between the speaker's starvation and the honey of the bees. So she also calls the bees her honey machine, and which will work without thinking, like literally like a machine. And we see this reappearance of the virgin metaphor of the bees. And in the end of the poem, this is where the rebirth of the queen bee happens, which again, similar to the first poem, we see a kind of merging of the queen bee and the speaker's persona. Plath calls the queen bee, names she has a lion red body, which alludes to, again, Plath's other poetic personas, calling on the red hair in Lady Lazarus, the lioness in Porta, or God's lioness in Ariam. And the end is a sort of escape by flying, in which again we saw this merging of the speaker and the queen bee, and Plath creates again this dreamlike vision, not being able to distinguish if she is talking about the speaker or the queen bee. Finally, the last poem is titled Wintering, in which the Plath returns to the white-black opposition and calling the bees a mass of black, which alludes to the black mass, naming mainly, which is another name for the witch's Sabbath. So again, we see here a sort of explicit naming of the bees as diabolic creatures who are almost, the hive is again alluding to a sort of coven, a sort of cult. And in this poem, we see a return of the bees as women. And the poem ends with an association of the rebirth of the bees and them being fertile, creative producers of honey, alluding to the fertility metaphor or the fertility witch cult. And we see a sort of hope in the end, which is associated to female survival and female creative production, and in which fertility is not just alluded as a sort of reproduction or production, but also fertility as fertile creative production of Plath herself as well, being a poet. And to conclude my presentation, I want to highlight the shift in the speaker's attitude towards the bees, moving on from being the other to being one of them, or to being herself, being the queen bee. And in this poem, in the sequence, we see the female identity developing, having these multiply attributes of being both maternal, sexual, creative, and also non-human, suggesting that this rebirth of the poetic persona is only possible in the female and fertile environment. And I want to again return to Murray's witch cult hypothesis, which I think offers a new reading to the bee poems, in which we can understand them as a fertility-centered cult, alluding to the bees as witches as well, showing this pattern, developing pattern in Plath's poems, in which she associates flying creatures with female autonomy and female creative production. Thank you for your attention.